Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Shilpa, and I'm a research assistant with the Fairwork project. Fairwork is an action research project that's jointly coordinated by the Oxford Internet Institute and the VSETB Berlin Social Science Center. And we study working conditions in the digital economy with a particular focus on fairness. And our aim is to use this research to help improve conditions for workers. Through rigorous worker-informed research, we assess platform practices against a set of robust fair work principles to evaluate how platforms perform on issues like fair pay, fair conditions, and fair representation. And we use this data to give each platform a score out of 10 and to rank them. And in doing so, we've created a comprehensive and widely cited benchmark of fairness in the platform economy. So, our work not only shines a light on exploitative practices, but also equips policymakers, companies, and the public with the tools to demand better standards. Fairwork's findings have influenced regulation, reshaped company policies, and to date, we've got companies to make over 300 changes to their policies through our research. And it's also informed debates on working conditions in 40 countries. We're all here today to launch our new report, which is called Platform Sexwork, Working Conditions in the Online Sex Work Industry, which will be available online immediately after this webinar. And I'm joined today by Robbie Warren, who is the project lead for the Fairwork Sexwork project, who will be presenting the findings of the report. Following Robbie's presentation, we'll hear remarks from our fantastic panel of speakers, Blake, Vex, Jessica, and Yeet, and each will share a few reflections on the report, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion, which will be followed by a Q&A from the audience. Thank you again for joining us and making time to be here for the launch of the report, and I'll hand things over to Robbie to get us started.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, Shilpa, for the introduction there. My name is Robbie Warren. I'm a PhD student at Royal Holloway University of London, and I am a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I lead the Fairwork Sexwork project. I'm going to give a presentation of about 20 minutes, just talking about the report that we're releasing today, and introducing kind of like the context of it and some of the key findings that we've had. Before I do that, there's two people who I want to give a shout out to quickly. The first of those is Polly Blake, who sadly can't be here today. Polly Blake was my co-author on this project. She can't be here because she is busy organizing the 16th birthday party for the Sex Worker Action Research Movement, which for anyone who's London-based is happening, I think, at Pelican House tomorrow. And organizing a party for a sex worker-led organization is probably the best excuse for not attending a webinar about workers' rights. The second person I need to thank is Simone Kodarura, who is the Fairwork comms manager. She can't be here as well because she is ill, but she was instrumental in putting together this report and organizing this webinar today. Okay, cool. Just going to start my timer so I'm on time. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me 1 sec. Okay, brilliant. Hopefully you can all see this. So I'm going to talk a bit about the report that we're releasing today. It's entitled Platform Sex Work, Working Conditions in the Online Sex Work Industry. I'm going to start off by talking about the broader context of platform sex work and why we felt that this research was important and why it was important for Fairwork to make an intervention and a contribution to the space. And then also I'm going to talk briefly about some of the key research findings that we came up with in our report. So firstly, sex workers' use of the internet and of digital spaces and of digital services is highly policed. And being a sex worker online is very difficult. For example, a sex worker's use of social media platforms, sex workers face a much higher risk of disciplinary actions like account deletions and shadow banning. A report by Hacking and Hustling found that 70% of sex workers had experienced shadow banning as a result of their use of social media platforms. This policing of sex workers' use of digital spaces is enhanced by legislation, most famously Foster-Sester, which increases the policing of online spaces and has led to the closure of a number of key digital services which sex workers use. Most famously, Foster-Sester led to the closure of Backpage, which was an important resource for in-person sex workers to use to advertise their services. But Foster-Sester also led to the closure of a number of key resources, including closed social media groups and Reddit subs, which were used by sex workers to share information on things such as bad clients. And the impact of this was to worsen working conditions. In addition, digital services like financial payment systems are denied to sex workers, and sex workers face an incredibly high rate of exclusion from services such as PayPal if they use them to take payments for their work. Furthermore, attempts to fill this space with sex worker-led alternatives often face this same level of stigma. Two examples here include SpankPay, which was forced to close in 2023, and WishTender, closed in 2024, both as a result of being denied services from their upstream payment providers due to the fact that they were taking payments for sexual services. So the result of this pushing of sex workers off of the mainstream spaces of the internet and off of the mainstream digital services that many of us take for granted is that they are funneled into bespoke digital architectures, which in this report we refer to as online sex work platforms. Now, these digital architectures are specifically designed for sex work, and they can take a number of different forms. In this research, we look at 3 different forms. We look at webcamming, content creation platforms, and platforms that facilitate in-person meetings. And these online sex work platforms are digital intermediaries that enable interactions between sex workers and their clients. Now, for any of you in the audience who are aware or have read much about the online sex work industry, a common term that's used is adult sex work platforms. In this research, we've opted for the term online sex work platforms as we wanted to really highlight and emphasize the key role that these platforms play in shaping working conditions. They are not passive websites, but active agents which play a powerful role. They are platforms are infrastructures that shape and condition workers' activities in powerful ways based on the decisions made by the companies that run them. So one of the problems with this pushing of sex workers off of the mainstream spaces of the internet and into these bespoke digital infrastructures is there is a complete absence of protections and controls to ensure that once they get there, the work that these platforms are providing is fair, decent, and just. Whilst legislation from governments is certainly pushing workers into these platforms, this same legislation is doing nothing to ensure that these platforms are held to account. Furthermore, whilst throughout the gig economy as a whole, we can generally comprise working conditions as being characterized by low pay, precarious labor rights, and a lack of workplace protections, what minimal legislative steps have been made to try and protect workers within the gig economy unilaterally exclude sex workers who are used by digital platforms. Just one example of this is the EU Platform Directive. Now, the EU Platform Directive is a piece of legislation which aims to help fight for the working status of misclassified workers in the gig economy, as well as protect their working rights and improve their working conditions. Yet the EU Platform Directive makes absolutely no mention of sex workers, either who do location-based or completely online work. And this is despite the long histories of sex workers making use of digital platforms. The histories of these platforms often precludes the histories of the platforms which we traditionally understand as making up the gig economy. In addition, over the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen journalists, we've seen activists, and we've seen trade unionists subject platforms to a sustained critique. We've seen journalists shine a light on the poor working conditions throughout the gig economy and the role that these platforms play in shaping these conditions. Yet when it comes to sex work, we are stuck between 2 narratives, one which espouses the apparent huge wages that could be earned by any of us if only we turned to online sex work. And on the other side, we see stories of violence, of coercion, and of sex trafficking. And what's lacking from these narratives is the voices of the workers themselves and the stories of work which comprise both the negative aspects of it, but also the positives. What's lacking is research that engages with online sex work as work, that engages with digital platforms as workplaces, that asks fundamental questions surrounding the types of issues workers face and the role platforms play in shaping these conditions. So within this space, we are releasing our report today as a means to kind of try and engage with some of these research gaps and gaps in the literature. The report has two kind of key sides to it. The first side is that it provides comprehensive, rigorous research on working conditions experienced by sex workers who make use of digital platforms. And this part of it, I'm kind of going to talk about in the second part of the presentation. I'm not really going to talk about that now, but I'll go into that in the second part. But what I want to talk about briefly now is the second part of the research. And so what we're doing as part of this research is we're publishing a set of Fairwork principles specifically designed for platforms that mediate sex work. What these principles are is they are a set of basic minimum standards which we think all platforms could and should implement to ensure that platform sex work is fair, is decent, and is just. Now, we've put together 10 individual principles, and each one of these principles is made up of a number of different thresholds. And what these thresholds we hope do is they outline in concrete terms, easily to understand, what are the kind of changes that platforms could implement to greatly improve the working lives of the thousands, if not millions of people who use these platforms to make a livelihood. And we think these principles have two kind of key uses. The first of them is a tool for workers, for policymakers, for platforms, and for the general public to kind of try and understand, to reimagine in concrete terms what kind of changes could be made and could be implemented to make platform sex work fairer for the workers who use these platforms. The second side of this is that these principles lay the groundwork and enable Fairwork to, in the future, conduct annual scoring of platforms that mediate sex work. This will allow us to create rankings and enable us to compare and contrast the varying working conditions that these platforms are providing. Okay, so that's kind of like the first part of the presentation. And in the second part, I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about the research findings that we came up with and the kind of types of conditions that we document in the report. This is going to be necessarily a bit of just like a flash look at some of the key research findings. And I really would encourage you to go read the report if you're interested, where we document the full findings. So firstly, I'm just going to introduce the platforms that we looked at. So we looked at 4 platforms. The first of them is OnlyFans. OnlyFans is probably the most well-known online sex work platform in the world, and it is a content creation platform. Second platform we looked at is a webcamming platform, which is Streamate, and Streamate operates a premium model where workers are paid a fixed rate per unit of time. The third platform is Chaturbate, which is another webcamming platform, but it operates what's called a freemium model, which is where workers are paid in tips. And the fourth is AdultWork. And AdultWork is what we call a multi-service platform, and it offers a range of different services, including webcamming, including content creation. But key, AdultWork offers the capacity to organize in-person meetings between workers and clients as well. So the methodology of this project is we undertook 79 surveys and 34 interviews with workers who were currently active on at least one of these platforms. Participants were spread across 14 different countries and 4 continents, and this was undertaken from September 2023 to January 2024. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the research finding, and like I said, I would really encourage you to go read the report if you're interested, because this will just be a whistle-stop tour. Firstly, in terms of the demographics of our sample, they were predominantly young. The largest group was between 25 to 34, but the vast majority of participants were below the age of 44. In terms of gender, again, the vast majority of our sample were cis women, although there was a significant proportion of the sample who identified as transgender, with cis men just making up 5% of the sample as a whole. In terms of the time worked on the platform, the vast majority of the sample had worked on the platform for more than a year. I'm now going to talk about the research findings, and how we divided this is there's 5 key sections, and this is based on the broader Fairwork framework. So the 5 key sections of research are pay, conditions, contracts, management, and representation. And I'll talk about each one of these in turn. I think there's just one thing which I kind of feel like I have to say, which is that in this research, we generally talk about the negative aspects of this work. And the reason why we do this is because we want to identify key points where we think platforms could make changes which improve working conditions. That being said, work has documented a number of really positive things about online sex work, and they had a range of different motivations for why they did this, including allowing them to have financial stability, overcome challenges such as disability, which excluded them from mainstream work. These platforms were incredibly important sources of livelihoods for the people who use them to make a living. So in terms of the research findings, in terms of pay, whilst the rates of pay or the total levels of pay that people earn varied greatly within our sample, a major issue which was experienced by a lot of people was pay variability. One CAM model told us that on a weekly basis, her pay could vary by as much as 600%. And this pay variability contributed to a severe sense of financial instability. And 32% of our sample worried about not earning enough all of the time. I'm sorry, there's a police car going past, it's very loud. Apologies. So 32% of our sample worried about not earning enough all of the time. And this was additional 9% that said that they worried about not earning enough most of the time. And only 9% of our sample said that they never worried about not earning enough. Another key issue was unpaid labor. One CAM model told us, using statistics provided by the platform, that 94% of her time working on the platform was unpaid. A significant issue was refunds and chargebacks. Chargebacks was an issue specifically experienced by OnlyFans workers, and this was a really, really huge issue. And one of the key things was that workers felt that there was a systematic bias which favored clients instead of workers when it came to initiating refunds and facilitating chargebacks. And workers lacked a total absence of being able to provide evidence to show that refunds and chargebacks were fraudulent in nature. Finally, platform commissions were much higher than in other areas of the gig economy. At the lower end was OnlyFans, which takes 20% of all income. But at the high end was Streamate, and Streamate in some cases takes 70% of all the wages earned by workers on the platform. The second area was conditions, and one of the key issues that came about with conditions was the extraordinarily high level of abuse and harassment, with 69% of the sample experiencing abuse and harassment whilst working on the platforms. This abuse and harassment often took place based on protected characteristics, including race and gender, and was often violent and sexual in nature. Another key problem was doxing. Doxing is the purposeful releasing of identifiable information about an individual, and this was experienced by 34% of our sample as a result of their work. Finally, stalking was experienced by 26% of our sample as a result of their work, and this occurred across all the platforms and all the different types of work, both in-person work and fully remote work as well. The third area is contracts. And so when workers sign up to the platforms, they have to agree to terms and conditions. And these terms and conditions are really important as they lay out what workers can and can't do on the platform. Key issues that workers faced was clarity, specifically relating to what kinds of content were and weren't allowed on the platforms. This posed a number of problems for workers as they were navigating rules that they couldn't understand and weren't made explicit to them, putting them at high risk of disciplinary actions by the platforms, including deactivations. A second area was data protection. Sex work is an incredibly stigmatized area of work, and platforms are collecting identifiable information about workers, but they aren't clear about what they're doing with this information, how it's being stored, and whether it is being shared with third parties, including foreign governments. Finally, the third area we looked at was what happens when clients break contracts. This specifically related to what happens when clients steal workers' content and post it on third-party websites, and what resources workers have. In this case, platforms provided minimal tools to prevent this taking place, and when it did happen, they provided minimal tools to help have it taken down. In terms of management, whilst channels of communication generally did exist between workers and clients, between workers and platforms, many workers found that these channels were just woefully inadequate, specifically given the gravity of many of the issues that they were dealing with whilst working on these platforms. Secondary disciplinary actions, including account deactivations and suspensions, were incredibly prevalent, with 50% of our sample experiencing disciplinary actions, with limited access to appeals to contest or provide evidence against these disciplinary actions. The final area is representation, and this relates to workers' ability to access collective organizing and collective support. None of the 4 platforms had made any formal attempts to engage with a trade union that we're aware of, and there was no formal trade union representation for any of the platforms. This being said, 77% of our sample said they were interested in joining a union or a workers' association, as they believe this would give them greater collective power and be able to counter any negative changes made by the platform, and also provide a space for solidarity. And with that, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear all the panelists, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming and joining and being part of this today.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Shall I just jump in now, or do you want?
I think Shilpa's going to introduce you. I think that was...
Yeah, I am. Thanks so much, Robbie. So we're now going to be hearing from our panelists, starting with Blake. Blake is a sex worker and activist based in the UK and a member of the Sex Workers Union, which is the UK's largest union representing sex workers, including strippers, cam models, and full-service workers. And the union provides legal assistance, access to healthcare services, and runs a range of campaigns aimed at improving working conditions and advocating against criminalization. Blake, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'm so excited to see this report. I think it's so needed, and I want to really acknowledge Robbie and your whole team for centering sex workers in this research process and consulting with us really closely all the way through. Sex work is work, but we often lack labour rights in our workplaces. So it's really great to have a document about working conditions that treats online sex work as work and treats digital platforms as workplaces, which means that the platform owners are our de facto employers. They're the ones that pay us, and they're the ones that control the conditions we labour under. But up until now, there's been no responsibility on their part to give us rights as workers. I really appreciated having it acknowledged that deplatforming and regulation like foster-sester and financial discrimination against sex workers increases our reliance on digital platforms and their monopoly. And there's so much good stuff in the report. I love the emphasis on the protection from abuse, the need for clear reporting channels, how important it is that we can block clients and get clarity around rules. I want to just tell like 3 short stories, especially focusing on AdultWork, which is a platform that so many UK sex workers rely on. We publish content on there, but we also use it to advertise in-person services, and it's one of the only platforms that allows us to do this. Deplatforming is such a huge problem, and having our accounts suspended or frozen without warning is just incredibly demoralizing when we rely on a platform as a source of income, especially if we've spent years building up an audience on there. It's so stressful to live with the precarity of not knowing if an account will be unsuspended. And AdultWork will suspend workers' accounts for all sorts of spurious reasons. Mentioning you do duos, which is really common. Listing services in your profile, which AdultWork actually lists in their checkbox, is like a service that you can tick. But then if you mention the same word in your profile, they'll suspend you, like with water sports, and there are a few other examples. Even if you're just accessing the site from a different country or via a VPN, for example, you need to get around public Wi-Fi blocks of adult sites, they can suspend your account and there's no guarantee that they'll unsuspend it. I also have personal experience, and I know that so many other workers do, of platforms like OnlyFans holding sex workers to a different standard from non-sex working creators on the site and applying their rules and their policies very inconsistently, where sex workers will have content deleted and will have their account suspended for publishing content which is allegedly in breach of rules that non-sex workers publishing on the site are getting away with. So it's great to have in the report that clarity and transparency around rules and how they're applied is going to be something that is recommended, as well as giving us the chance to appeal and edit content and re-upload it, as well as just be told what it is that we're meant to have done that was against the terms of service, because we're not even given this information. Going back to the thing about fair pay, I just want to very quickly flag how bad it is on AdultWork at the moment, with fee increases happening just continuously, imposed without warning. There's a new charge for changing your location on the site. The fees for camming have gone up. The fees for listing yourself as available now have gone up. And although in the past we used to be able to spend site credits, which we'd earned from customers buying our content on AdultWork, on publicizing our availability on the website and boosting ourselves in listings, making it a kind of self-sustaining economy, we can't do that anymore. So now, if we want to use our AdultWork credits, we have to do a bank transfer, which means we pay AdultWork 25%, and previously we didn't have to. And we have to send money into AdultWork and pay out of pocket to do that advertising. So we're certainly not notified of these changes within a reasonable time frame, which is one of the things the report suggests, which is amazing. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the discrimination of marginalized workers on AdultWork. For example, migrant workers are discriminated against by having to jump through far more hoops to create an account than workers with a UK passport do. And if you have a non-UK passport, your nationality is listed on AdultWork as the nationality on your passport, regardless of your cultural identity. And this can be very misrepresentative. It can expose workers to harassment from clients that are fetishizing workers from a certain ethnicity. And it can also just result in harassment from clients that feel that they've not been honestly told what nationality the worker is from if they've lived in the UK all their life but don't have a UK passport. Transgender workers are also highly discriminated against on AdultWork because they list your gender as the gender marker on your state document, even if you've been living in your chosen gender for many, many years. There's even been a recent example of a trans worker on AdultWork who had a female gender marker on her passport, but who was listed as a man on AdultWork in the listings because she ticked the trans tag on her profile. And it took her like 5 or 6 goes to get it changed. So it's so good that we've got this scrutiny, and that we're going to be able to use this report to try and advocate for better conditions on these platforms. I'm particularly delighted to have the stuff about trade union organising put in such a central position, because the Sex Workers Union is working really hard with sex workers all over the UK. We are our members. We don't accept bosses or managers. There's no third party. It's just us doing it ourselves. And we've done some amazing stuff with battling financial discrimination, and the closure of safe workplaces by councils. But we are still working really hard to try and advocate for better working conditions on digital platforms. And there's so many changes we want to see, which the report recommends. So hopefully this will be a really powerful tool. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Blake. Our next panelist is Jessica. Jessica is the co-founder and head of advocacy for MintStars, which is a content creation platform designed to provide an ethical alternative for sex workers. She's also a PhD student at Harvard University, where her research focuses on working conditions for sex workers in Latin America.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be part of this panel. I like to say that we aspire to be an ethical platform. Sometimes I cringe a little calling ourselves an ethical platform when I feel like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism or no ethical capitalist companies. And as mentioned, I also do research on the sex workers' rights movement in Latin America. And I'm also one of the founding members of the Boston Sex Workers and Allies Collective, which is focused on achieving decriminalization of sex work in Massachusetts. And I was so thrilled when Robbie reached out to me, first separately because he was also doing research on webcamming in Colombia, and I had been doing research on sex work in Colombia for the past several months. But then learning about Fairwork through him and seeing that Fairwork was including sex work among their ratings of platform work was so thrilling to me, because that's been a particular interest of mine, is drawing parallels between the working conditions between different types of precarious labor. And I wrote a paper about the similarities between clothing resale platforms and sex work platforms. And when I was doing that, I read this really interesting article about the working conditions on Poshmark, which is a clothing resale platform. And I read about how the sellers on Poshmark would like create little groups to like promote each other's posts and like uptick them so that they would get seen at the top. And I was like, oh my God, this is just like retweet groups that sex workers use on Twitter. If any sex workers are in the audience, online sex workers, they will probably know what I'm talking about. I think retweet groups are a little passe now because of changes to the Twitter algorithm. But I was like, this click work and unpaid labor just trying to get seen is so similar between these two types of platform, and it's not unique to sex work at all. But what I think that Robbie, you've done really well is demonstrate the way that the poor working conditions on sex work platforms are aggravated and multiplied by 10 because of the systematic and structural restrictions and challenges around the sex industry, both the regulatory barriers and the discrimination that exists around these platforms. And so as a platform founder, I wanted to kind of try to highlight what are the challenges in working conditions for sex workers that are within platforms and companies' control, and what are the ones that are outside their control, because I think it's really important in making demands of platforms to do better, to know what are the things that we can make demands about that are possible to improve, and where are the things that we need to target our efforts towards like more structural problems. So I'll talk a little bit first about our motivation for starting MinStars, what MinStars is, and then kind of what I've learned about the sources of these different problems through the process of building our platform. So MinStars was founded 3 years ago out of basically a lot of problems that I had seen for online sex workers in a few years of being really involved in the online sex work space. Primarily financial discrimination. So I was seeing, all these sex workers that I followed posting about having lost their payment apps like PayPal, Cash App, Venmo. And I think we need to see that as the first source of these problems, right? Like sex workers cannot get paid independently because all of the financial infrastructure that most people rely on to receive payments from their clients, from friends and family, exclude them, right? So if you can't get paid on payment apps, you have to rely on an adult platform, and that immediately takes a cut of your income, right? And if you can't get paid on PayPal, then you have to move to OnlyFans, which takes a 20% cut. And the second thing is censorship, right? A lot of these platforms don't allow a lot of kink content. They're discriminatory towards certain queer sex practices, and creators are constantly getting their accounts shut down without explanation, without an appeals process. And so we really wanted to address some of these problems And initially, we had the idea of building a platform that would enable sex workers to get paid without fear of financial discrimination using crypto payments on the back end. And the way that we do that is through enabling fans to essentially purchase USDC, which is a stable crypto coin, which is then used on the back end of the platform for payments. And then when creators get paid out, we convert it back into fiat. And the reason that crypto helps us solve some of the financial discrimination problems, oh man, I need to talk faster, it's a permissionless payment system, right? So once you have the crypto, nobody can block you from making payments. But through the process of building Winstars, we have come up across the same barrier that Robbie mentioned SpankPay came across, which is when you have to interact with the traditional financial system and fiat, that is when there's the potential for a bottleneck and someone can shut off your payments. And we have dealt with losing payment processors. We lost Wire, the same processor that SpankPay was relying on, and having to jump to new ones. So I'm going to try to skip ahead. Essentially, though, what I've learned is that there are a lot of things within platforms' control. And it astounds me constantly how low the bar is. But things that platforms can control is their fees, right? Like adult platforms face much higher fees from payment processors than a normal platform, and that drives fees up. But a lot of platforms take advantage of that to then drive their own profits even higher, and take advantage of the fact that they know that sex workers don't have alternatives, and take really egregious fees. A second thing is chargebacks. Yes, adult platforms face more stringent requirements as regards to chargebacks, but it is still entirely possible for the company and the platform to decide to take on the cost of those chargebacks themselves. And that's something we've chosen to do. If we as a tiny little platform have been able to protect our creators from chargebacks, these larger platforms can do it too. Thirdly is customer service and appeals processes. Yes, we are subject to some ridiculous restrictions in terms of content moderation requirements from payment processors, Visa and MasterCard. But what is within our control is having very clear content guidelines, being communicative with creators when something violates our terms, giving them the chance to rectify it, and having clear communication processes with our creators, which Robbie so eloquently clarified. And then finally, how we deal with reports, right? If someone reports content that violates our terms or reports piracy or reports non-consensual content, it is entirely within our control how quickly we respond to that and what action we take. So I really appreciate the balance here between kind of the structural barriers and then calling companies into account for what is within their control. And I hope to see Fairwork continue to do both of those things as you build out your ratings for platforms. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. We're now going to hear from Yeet, who is a senior program officer at the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance, which is a sex worker-led network of more than 100 organizations across 30 countries. The ESWA advocates for the rights of sex workers through innovative research, policy work, campaigns in areas such as digital rights, migration, and legal reform.
Hi, and thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Robbie and the Fairwork team for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Yeet, and I'm the Senior Program Officer at ESWA, European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance, where we advocate for the rights, health, and safety of sex workers across Europe and Central Asia, both on and offline. I am also a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, where my research focuses on sex work advertising platforms and privacy and sex work legal frameworks. So we are a community-led European network, and we work across various areas, including access to health, access to justice, migration and anti-racism, and the digital rights of sex workers. In our digital rights program, we worked on issues like online censorship and discrimination, privacy and data protection, algorithmic justice, platform accountability, and anything related to sex workers' digital rights. The Fairwork report is a very timely contribution, and it makes clear that the conversation about platform labor and what constitutes fair work must include sex workers. So your findings clearly show, I think, how platform design, governance, and inaction shape working conditions in often harmful ways. We see and hear that workers are, paid late or not at all for emotionally demanding and, really time-consuming labor. Workers talk about long hours spent online without income certainty. Commission rates are very high, and workers often face chargebacks, scams, and platform fees that basically they can't dispute. At ESWA, we've been working to document and challenge these dynamics since 2020. In November 2024, so a few months ago, we launched a report titled Labor Rights, Safety, and Privacy: How to Center Sex Workers' Needs on Advertisement Platforms. I'm sending you the links in the chat. So this is based on in-depth interviews with sex workers using advertising platforms, and we presented our findings at an online event. You can find the video recording of the events and the full report in the link I've just sent. Our research demonstrates that advertising platforms are not neutral intermediaries like they often present themselves. They shape, access to income and working conditions in really profound ways. And we argue that these platforms must be accountable infrastructures that center sex workers' autonomy, privacy, and safety. So through our findings, basically, we offered several key recommendations, and we demand that platforms improve accessibility by designing user-friendly interfaces, offering multilingual support, and providing essential safety features free of charge. They should support worker control by allowing, freedom in listings, pricing, and moderation, and offer tools for, client screening and safety. They should also strengthen data protection and privacy by minimizing the data collection, especially avoiding biometric systems like facial recognition, and provide education and resources that are co-developed with sex workers, including behavioral guidelines for clients and dedicated resource hubs on health, safety, and rights. So, but as much as we need to address platform level issues, we also have to confront something really much deeper and important, I think. Platforms do not exist in a vacuum. So platforms are, like everything else, shaped by broader social, legal, and cultural contexts that we live in. So the poor working conditions on sex work platforms or deplatforming and exclusion sex workers face on mainstream platforms are not just technical failures or design flaws or bad business models. Of course they are, but only partly. I think they are symptoms of something bigger, which is the criminalization of sex work and the stigma that surrounds sex work. So these structural forces shape how platforms are built, how they are moderated, and who they prioritize. Sex workers are marginalized online because they are criminalized and stigmatized offline. The absence of legal protections, the prevalence of financial discrimination, the impunity in which platforms operate are all reinforced basically by society's refusal to recognize sex work as legitimate work. This is something we also explored in our most recent report on social media accountability, which is the second link that I sent. It was also launched with an online event on the 28th of April. So in this report, we call on governments to decriminalize sex work fully, establish anti-discriminatory regulatory safeguards, including for migrants and racialized sex workers, and include sex workers in policymaking and the conflation of sex work and trafficking. So we also launched a campaign urging Meta to meet with sex workers and engage with the harms they help to produce basically. So if you're an organization, we'd love your support. Please click on the link and sign our statement. So at ESWA, while we strongly support reforms at the platform level, we are also calling for structural change. Without these platforms will continue to replicate the harms sex workers already face in offline spaces. So we welcome Fairwork's 10 principles for fair platform Sexwork. They really provide a strong evidence-based, baseline for platforms that are good addition to the sex work-led organizations around the world have been writing and advocating about. And I think I'm out of time, so that's all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yeet. Our final panelist is Vex. Vex is an independent prawn producer and performer and founder of the Four Chambers project. She began as a cam girl before launching Four Chambers in 2013, and the project represents a move away from traditional industry models, creating independent, conceptual, and creative porn cinema.
Hi, hey, I'm Vex. I'm talking today not necessarily as a representative of anyone other than myself and just a user of many of the platforms that have been discussed here over many years now. I started making work with sex online in 2011, and that started off with kind of some of the softcore porn sites, moving into camming on Chaturbate for 6 years, and on AdultWork. And then I've used many of the other iterations of kind of online sex work platforms that have come and gone. And one thing that stands out is the complete lack of financial security that exists for online sex work. There is no safe space for online sex workers in terms of building, maintaining a client base, knowing that you're going to be able to have a secure footing in order to build a kind of a safe working environment for yourself. You're expected to basically learn a new system, learn a new space, spend money establishing yourself, and then you will eventually, you come to understand, have the rug pulled from underneath you. In my experience, I have used spaces that, as Robbie mentioned, are kind of specifically for adult work, but also online spaces that make money off of the back of sex workers' labor, but are not explicitly adult content platforms. The Four Chambers project originally started raising money on a site called Patreon, which was a relatively fledgling site at the time, and allowed the work of sex workers to kind of line its coffers, and then as the legal situation got more complicated with work such as with the implementation of Foster Sester and the heightened censorship from payment processors, cleaned house essentially, and removed the work of the people who kind of laid the groundwork. And that was we were unfortunately victims of that, which basically meant losing the whole of the income for the project, my full-time income, overnight. They took with them our details of our subscriber bases, and it basically meant that we had to build an entirely new site from scratch in order to kind of to rebuild. That comes with significant financial cost, and we're lucky that we're able to work independently, or more independently than some of the other people who are working on these platforms. But what unfortunately that independence comes with is an extremely high financial burden, and it's both financial and it's also a burden of responsibility of, you know, I'm not a web developer. I'm not a financially minded person. I just wanted the freedom to be able to make the kind of weird porn that I was interested in. And it kind of requires you at every level to be doing an incredible amount of difficult, often boring, and often kind of bureaucratic labor in order to maintain our independence. And the sites that we're talking about, for a lot of people, are the only way that they're able to access income from sex work. It's so difficult to be independent. But for us, what we've realized is the further up that chain you can go, there, at each level, there are different rules. So, you know, if you're using something like OnlyFans, they will have certain rules about what kind of content. And if you can get away from that and do what we're doing, which is to have your own site at great financial and kind of technological cost, what that does is you get a little bit of freedom. You get a little bit more freedom and security, but we're still beholden to the whims of the payment processors, and our payment processor is beholden to the whims of Visa and MasterCard, and Visa and MasterCard are beholden to the whims of the government. And at each level, there's extra censorship and there's extra discrimination. And what it means is that at the end of it, only the most kind of safe, homogenized, normative workers can exist. And the people who fall by the wayside are people who are trying to work independently, or who are creating work or just living in bodies that challenge some of those more like normative ideas about sex and sexuality. So I think we are what happens is it's both a detriment to like workers' financial security, workers' freedom, and you know, the diversity of the people who are able to kind of rise to the top and to get paid. You know, we don't often, the people who are at the very top of these platforms are hidden by multiple different levels of like shell companies and anonymity. There isn't any accountability for the people who are making money from sex workers' labor. But online sex work requires you to be incredibly visible, you know, the opposite of anonymous. And, you know, for me, I don't see why we should allow people to extract wealth from our labor and get away without being accountable for the ways in which they impact the people on the ground who are doing the work.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vex. There's so much of what you said that I want to just dive into and talk about more. And hopefully we'll have some space to do that in the panel discussion as well. Yeah, thank you so much to all of our panelists for their contributions. They were all fascinating, and I'm really happy that you all agreed to be part of this panel. It's such a privilege to be able to put such a great group of people together. We're now going to have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And I would encourage anyone who is part of the audience here, they can post their questions in the chat, and I will ask them to the panelists so they can answer. But to start off with, I'm gonna ask a question, if that's okay, to our panelists. I'm gonna ask two, and you can kind of choose which one you want to. I think for me, there's one thing which often when I'm doing this research, there is an element of what you're talking about can sound quite mundane. When you talk about account deactivation or account suspension, it can sound quite, it doesn't sound like a big deal in a way. Like, you know, if I were to have my Instagram deleted, it wouldn't mean that much to me. But I think one thing that would be really great if you could respond to is that idea of the instability of working via these digital platforms, and the importance of things like deactivation measures, the importance of things like access to appeals process, the importance of having open channels of communication with a platform. So I think it would be really great if anyone on the panel is able to kind of respond to that and just talk about the importance of these things, and how much they influence things like financial stability, things like feelings of precarity. The second question, which you can choose to answer, is broadly thinking about the changes within the way in which sex work is undertaken and the role that platforms play within how sex workers go about making a living. And I think if you choose to, you can answer this in the broader sense. So we could think about that in terms of the specific platforms that we're focusing on in the research, but also this massive ecosystem of different platforms that makes up social media sites, that makes up payment processes, and how this range of different things work together and how that's changed over the last 10 to 20 years. And now I'm going to open the floor to anyone on the panel who feels like they want to jump in.
Yeah, I can definitely jump in. I feel like those questions are quite connected, actually. because I feel like the space is shrinking every year. Like, we've not only had laws like Foster Sester and laws in the UK which have controlled what we can post online, but the deplatform thing, I mean, speaking personally, it's every single time it happens, I feel like I want to quit. But if I had a better way of making enough money around like parenthood and part-time hours, I would do it. So, and it's really hard to change career when you don't have a CV. So yeah, I've had YouTube accounts deleted, like Instagram accounts deleted. I've given up on Instagram. Like platforms that I spent years building up. OnlyFans I was running, didn't make much money off, even though I've got a big audience elsewhere because it's just so competitive on there. And then had like half my content flagged overnight without any sort of explanation, and they were putting me on my last warning. I've just lost my newsletter provider twice, like Mailjet, which was recommended to me as like explicitly adult friendly. They just banned me without explanation. So I can't, I'm doing that thing, Vex, that you're doing with this like independent membership site as well as using platforms, but it's just getting harder and harder and harder to do it. And it feels like if they're trying to just make it impossible to do online sex work, what do they expect people to do? Do they expect us to relax our boundaries and do more offline forms of work that we prefer not to, or that make us less safe, or work for abusive brothel managers, or like at the strip clubs that they're trying to close down? Or are we just meant to not be able to afford our groceries or our rent? It is definitely getting harder and harder, especially with the only social media platform, Twitter, where we were sort of free to advertise, now being owned by the Nazis and not an algorithm that supports us in approaching ourselves.
I can jump in here because I was going to speak to that as well. I have seen and experienced that getting shut down by platforms, both sex work platforms and financial platforms, is quite literally traumatizing to people, because when you get that notification, like your account has been banned, you feel like you are being accused of being a criminal. You feel like a second-class citizen who doesn't have access to the same infrastructure as the rest of society. Like, imagine if a brick and mortar business tomorrow was no longer able to accept credit cards. Well, they're going to have a massive drop in their earnings. And for individual sex workers, that massive drop in their earnings for many people can be the difference between being able to make rent that month and being evicted and becoming homeless. And that's not an exaggeration. Like, in the Boston Sex Workers and Allies Collective, we recently learned that one of our members had become homeless, and has an income from content creation. And if folks within our collective who are dependent on that income from content creation and are living on the edge and not sure if they're going to make rent, if they lose their payment processor, that can be the difference between, are they going to be able to stay in stable housing or not? Are they going to end up in a situation where they have to engage in riskier street-based sex work and be subjected to violence or not? And so I have said that financial discrimination quite literally kills sex workers, and that sounds alarmist, but it is true.
Yeah, I think similarly, what's really difficult is that sex work and sex workers really built the internet as we know it today. Every single popular thing online has developed as the result of sex workers pushing technology due to the demand for sex online. But sex workers are treated as disposable collateral in a race for kind of platform supremacy. And under any other in any other arena that was not the online space, essentially losing accounts in this way is getting fired from your job without notice, without explanation, multiple times, and you're expected to kind of start again. And I think that kind of disposability the idea that platforms essentially want to kind of like extract our labor, use it to grow, to kind of keep people's eyes on, to kind of lure people in onto using these spaces, and then they are quite happy to treat their workers in the same way that society kind of treats sex workers, which is with a level of kind of disposability, and we don't want to look at that. We don't want to have to deal with the kind of complicated kind of financial moral soup that is like dealing with sexuality at the moment. So I think it really, like, from a labor rights perspective, it is really like the Wild West out there. There just kind of is no protection for people at all. And yeah, you're 100% right. It puts people in increasingly precarious situations where they're forced to take less and less safe work and engage in less and less safe practices. Like, the internet really has been a huge tool of safety for sex workers, and we are losing that tool at an exponentially increasing rate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vex, and all of the panelists. I think, yeah, there's one thing that I didn't talk about the presentation, which I wanted to, but I didn't quite have time, is just the way in which this industry functions and the variations between how platforms work and their company structures in relation to the other companies that make up what we would understand as being the gig economy. There is such a high level of secrecy that these companies operate. And it's very hard to know anything about how they operate. They're almost always privately held. They often always, they're predominantly often held, have holding companies, and these holding companies are generally held in secrecy jurisdictions, which means that they are not making publicly available any information about their company structures and how they work. So when I was doing the research for the report, I was trying to find out basic things about, like, who are the staff on these companies? Who is their CEO? I mean, like, I'd love to know how many workers are on there and what their annual profits are, but I'd quite like to know just like who works there. But it's impossible to find out any of this information for the vast majority of these platforms. An extreme case is AdultWork, and AdultWork is a platform which basically only operates in the UK, but which is registered in Cyprus. The Sex Workers Union asked a investigative journalist agency based in the Netherlands, who have a specialist concern with researching corporate secrecy, and they did research into AdultWork, and they could find nothing. Their result at the end was just like, yeah, we don't know anything about this. The levels of secrecy that these platforms are operating is significantly higher than other businesses within the platform economy. We're now going to have a question from Julia. Yeah, I'd encourage everyone, if you have questions, please do post them in the chat. There's not been that many so far, so please feel free. So Julia says, what are the most important safety features platforms can offer? If you could choose one safety feature that platforms should implement, what would it be?
I feel like one feels, you've really got to choose your favorite. I think we could all probably go for like a smorgasbord of like ones that would generally help. I think probably kind of generally something to do with like a like protect, like account protection, and like on a like real life person to person kind of moderation. So like having the ability to speak to a representative at that company that you're working for, to have, sex work is this like deeply vulnerable, deeply personal, interperson dynamics, whether it's in person or it's online. And it requires personal human moderation, because it's based on these incredibly kind of complicated like social interactions. And I think that like having the protection of knowing that you have a representative at your platform who's a real person, who you're able to kind of like raise your queries with, explain why you need to block this person, why this situation is unsafe, like why understand why your payment is going to be late, and actually be able to kind of have that real representative, I think for me would make a huge difference, and probably for lots of other people.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because there's a huge amount of abuse, and so being able to block customers and report them for sending us non-consensual images or abusive images that we haven't like consented to see, and have that actually be taken seriously by the platform rather than just ignored or swept under the carpet, and to be able to block clients without being penalized for it, or them raising complaints that are then treated as some sort of like he said, she said, two sides of the same story thing. I mean, that's really, really good. But also, like, financial security is safety, because if we have no certainty that we're going to get paid from online work, then we're going to be doing offline work, which is less safe. So it's really hard to sort of deprioritize the financial side of things and the protections around being paid reliably on time, not being stiffed with massive fee increases, not having our funds frozen because our account's been suspended without recourse. That it doesn't feel less dangerous, honestly, than the in-person harassment that we can deal with from clients, and which also needs taking really, really seriously.
I was going to say that for me, the most important thing is protecting people's money, and for platforms to have multiple payment processors. Easier said than done. We've been going through dozens of payment processor applications and being rejected left and right. And having fail safes if you lose your payment processor or bank account. Like, you have to plan for that scenario, because it is going to happen. It's not, it could happen, it is going to happen. And for us, one of our hypotheses was that building on crypto rails would help provide fail safes for that. And that has proved to be true. We lost our payment processor a month ago, and that has been very frustrating. But thankfully, because we offer crypto payouts, we have not ended up in the situation where we were unable to pay out people's funds. People can still access their funds. It's a bit more frustrating than we would like it to be, but we never wanted to be in a scenario where people were unable to access their money and couldn't make rent if they needed that money, or were freaking out that we might steal their money, which unfortunately has happened in a lot of alternative platform cases.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think for me, this isn't necessarily an answer to the question, but one of the things I found really shocking throughout the research is just how much of an adversarial relationship workers feel that they have with platforms. There's just a total feeling that platforms are not doing anything to support them. And in fact, that there's this really, it's an us against them mentality, in that workers do not have any kind of expectation of there being anything to support, because platforms are just so absent. One thing I found really interesting was we had a fantastic expert roundtable, which Blake was part of, to discuss the research and kind of discuss some of the principles. And as part of the research, lots of people face really severe issues, and they have to look, and they just don't know. There's no guide on how to use these platforms. You don't sign up to Chaturbate and anyone kind of gives you an introduction of how to do it. They just give you the stream and you start working. So that means that a lot of time people have to use social media channels and different resources to get support and help from other workers, so they can learn to actually do this work and avoid things like scams and avoid things such as clients who are going to rip them off. And I remember at their expert roundtable, I was like, well, we could have training. Maybe the platform should have like an obligatory training or something which you can have. And everyone was just there like, but we just don't trust the platforms to provide training which is in any way good. It's just like, there's such a feeling that there's so little trust that that platforms are going to support workers, that there's just a complete divide there. So I think a lot of that thing about safety features is also rebuilding that trust, providing that sense that platforms are going to be there to support workers throughout this process. There are two questions from me, which I'm just going to answer very quickly. One is from Erin around studios. No, we didn't include studios within our research. That was due to difficulties actually kind of like finding workers with which to do to actually interview because we weren't able to access them rather than a specific decision. And in terms of Rebecca, I'll just briefly answer in terms of the principles. Based on the research we did, we drew up a preliminary set of principles, which it was in response to the research that we did and the issues that we encountered. We then took that to an expert roundtable, which included sex work organizations, sex workers, academics, and third sector organizations. And then based on the workshopping we did in that day, then we revised the principles, and that's what you find in the report. But if you need any more info, just pop me an email. Okay, we're at time. Does anyone of the panel have any final burning things they want to say before I close the session?
I mean, it's actionable perhaps, but what I wanted to say was the one thing that platforms could do to improve safety is to advocate for decriminalisation of sex work. But I appreciate that that is beyond the scope of this report. But wouldn't it be great if they all had statements and were actually campaigning for decrim? Because that is what is actually going to help sex workers in the real world.
Yeah, of course, Blake. Thanks so much for that. And that is the one thing that we, of course, the decriminalisation of sex work is one of the most important things for all sex workers, whether they work via platforms or not. Decriminalising sex work is the most important thing that we can all campaign for within improving rights within this industry. Okay, I'm going to just give a quick thank you. I'm going to say thank you to Philip Wu and Phil Krang. I'm going to say thank you to Shilpa and Simone. I'm going to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists, Jessica, Vex, Blake, and Eat. And I'm going to say a big thank you to all of you for coming and being part of this session today. I am going to quickly post, the report is now live, and I'm going to post a link in the chat to where you can access the report. I hope you all go read it. Please do share it with your networks. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, please just get in touch with me. And thank you so much for coming. Hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.